Draven froze as the woman's reflection smiled at him, but his own reflection didn't move. Draven Caine never believed in ghost stories. He prided himself on his skepticism, often dismissing local tales as tricks of the imagination. But on this stormy night, as his car sputtered to a halt on a deserted road, he was forced to reconsider. His phone was dead, and the nearest town was miles away. In the distance, perched like a predator, was Ravencroft Manor, a house whispered about in chilling stories for years. The mansion was beautiful, unsettlingly so. Its white walls gleamed, the windows flickering with faint candlelight, yet no one had lived there for decades. Legend spoke of a widow who once owned the house, though no one had ever seen her face. Each night, her figure would appear in the upstairs window, her long black hair cascading down her back, standing still, waiting for something or someone. Draven, desperate for shelter from the storm, approached the gate. Thunder cracked above, and just as his hand touched the iron handle, the gate swung open with an eerie, rusted screech. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but his body moved forward, drawn inexplicably toward the house. The door to the mansion opened before he could knock. Inside, the air felt heavy and damp, a suffocating chill that seemed to sink into his bones. The scent of rotting flowers permeated the grand hallway, and though there was no wind, the tall candles lining the walls flickered unnervingly. Portraits of a woman in black hung from the walls, her face always turned away or hidden beneath her hair. Draven's unease deepened when he noticed something strange. His footsteps echoed, but a second set of steps seemed to follow a beat behind his own. His breath hitched and he turned sharply. No one was there. The staircase loomed ahead, twisting upward like a spiral of bones. His eyes were drawn to the large mirror in the hall, a monstrous thing framed in gold. Something shifted in the reflection. There she was, the widow. She stood at the top of the stairs, her back to him, her hair long and tangled. His heart thudded painfully in his chest. He blinked and she was gone. He turned to look up the stairs, empty. His skin prickled as an icy breeze swept through the hall, rattling the windows. His legs moved on their own, climbing the stairs toward the second floor, where every shadow seemed to crawl. At the landing, a darkened hallway stretched before him. The flickering of candlelight drew him to the end, to a large door slightly ajar. His breath came in short, nervous bursts as he pushed the door open. Inside was a vast, ornate bedroom, frozen in time. The bed was perfectly made. A gown lay draped across a chair, and a large vanity mirror stood against the wall. The mirror was cracked, and in its broken reflection the widow stood again, this time facing him. Her face was hidden behind a veil of hair, but he could feel her eyes burning into his soul. Draven's knees buckled as the room seemed to warp and spin. The door slammed shut behind him, and in the shattered fragments of the mirror, she moved, closer, impossibly close. He turned to flee, but his feet were glued to the floor. Panic swelled in his chest. She whispered, "You shouldn't have come." Suddenly the air grew dense with the stench of decay, and he felt cold fingers brush the back of his neck. He jerked forward, his body paralyzed as he gazed into the mirror. The widow's reflection loomed behind him, her face still obscured, but her grip tightened. In the reflection, the room began to change. No longer the elegant chamber it once was. The walls rotted, the ceiling sagged with moisture, and the bed was nothing but decayed wood and moth-eaten sheets. A loud dripping sound filled his ears. He glanced down and saw water pooling around his feet, thick and dark. The sound of something heavy dragging across the floor echoed through the room. He turned back to the mirror just as the widow's hand closed around his wrist. In a violent rush, memories flooded Draven's mind. He had been here before. Years ago, he had been in a car accident, and this was the place he had wandered into. The widow had lured him in. That night, she had claimed him. The reflection of his younger self appeared in the mirror, desperate, soaked to the bone, staring at the woman who wasn't real. He had died in this house, drowned in the very bathroom he had passed moments earlier, submerged beneath murky water as the widow watched, her veiled face smiling coldly. She hadn't let him go. He had never left. The life he thought he'd lived after that night was nothing but an illusion, a trap. He had returned to the house again and again, unaware that he was already dead. Now, in the reflection, he saw his own face begin to change, his eyes hollowing, skin paling. His image was fading, replaced by another, a new victim at the door, about to walk in, lured by the same reflection. The widow released him, stepping back into the shadows as Draven's spirit was sealed inside the mirror. The reflection would never stop. Another would come, and when they did, Draven would be the one waiting for them, just as the widow had waited for him. Caius finds a cursed ventriloquist doll that whispers his name, only to discover he's now trapped as its puppet in a nightmarish performance dot. It started with a whisper. Caius was locking up his small puppet workshop late one night when he first heard it, a faint voice, distant yet unmistakable. At first, he thought it was a trick of his tired mind, some sound carried through the silence. But as he turned to leave, the voice came again, clearer this time. It called his name. Caius. He froze, heart pounding. The street behind him was deserted, the glow of the streetlights dim and flickering. The building stood silent and dark, but the voice persisted, low and beckoning. At the end of the block, a light caught his eye. The abandoned marionette theater, long neglected, was suddenly aglow. Caius knew it had been locked up for years, its windows covered in grime. Yet now warm light spilled through the cracks of the door. Against his better judgment, he moved toward the theater. Something about it had always drawn him in, a strange fascination he couldn't explain. The whispering grew louder as he approached, tugging at his mind, pulling him closer. The doors creaked open, spilling darkness from within. Dust choked the air, thick and stale, and the smell of rot clawed at Caius's throat. Inside, the shadows seemed to pulse, curling around the ruins as if something hidden was watching, waiting. Yet amidst the decay, something caught Caius's eye, a small ornate chest tucked beneath a pile of old props. He hesitated, but felt an almost magnetic pull toward the chest. Kneeling beside it, he brushed away years of dust and forced the rusted lock open. Inside was a ventriloquist doll. Its face, pale and cracked, stared back at him with disturbingly lifelike eyes. It wore a faded tuxedo, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, as if frozen mid-sentence. A small yellowed note was pinned to its chest. "Speak for me, and I will speak for you. Refuse, and I will make you listen." Caius felt a chill run down his spine. He wanted to leave the doll behind, but something about it captivated him. Without thinking, he lifted it from the chest. The doll was heavier than it looked, its wooden limbs cold to the touch. Its eyes seemed to glisten, as though they were following his every move. Caius stepped outside. The light in the theater flickered and died, plunging the building back into darkness. The whispering had stopped, but the air around him felt oppressive, thick with something unseen. As Caius made his way home, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had invited something sinister into his life. The doll felt heavier in his hands, as if it were filled with some dark essence. He glanced back at the theater, its shadowy silhouette looming behind him like a predator waiting for its prey. Once inside his apartment, he placed the doll on the shelf, its beady eyes glinting in the low light. "You'll be my star," he muttered, trying to brush off the creeping dread that clung to him. But sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the floorboards made his heart race. Every whisper of the wind sent chills down his spine. Hours passed, and finally, exhaustion overtook him. He drifted into a restless slumber, but the dreams came swiftly, nightmares where he was on stage, performing with the doll in front of an invisible audience. The doll's voice echoed through his mind, commanding him, forcing him to speak. "Do you see me, Caius?" It would croak, its grin widening until it consumed its entire face. Caius awoke with a start, drenched in sweat, his heart hammering. The room was dark and still. It took a moment for him to remember the doll. He glanced at the shelf, but the doll was gone. A cold shiver ran down his spine. He searched frantically, flipping on lights and peering under furniture. As he turned to his bedroom door, he froze. There it stood, the doll, impossibly upright, its eyes glimmering with a malevolent intelligence. It was no longer just a puppet. It felt alive. "You've neglected me, Caius," it said, its voice dripping with disdain. No longer a whisper, but a commanding presence that filled the room. Panic surged through him. "This isn't real," he gasped, stumbling back. But the doll stepped forward, and as it did, the shadows around it deepened, twisting into shapes that writhed like living tendrils. "I've waited long enough for a voice. Now you will pay." The doll lunged, and Caius felt an icy grip on his throat, its tiny fingers impossibly strong. He gasped for air as the room darkened, the walls closing in on him. Just when he thought he would suffocate, a flash of desperate inspiration struck him. "I command you to stop," he shouted, the ventriloquist's instincts kicking in. The doll paused, the grip slackening just enough for him to breathe. In a surge of defiance, Caius grabbed his puppeteer's mallet from a nearby shelf and swung it at the doll. It connected with a sickening crack, sending the doll sprawling across the floor. To his horror, its wooden body cracked open, revealing not stuffing, but a swirling void that seemed to draw in the light around it. "You think you can rid yourself of me?" the doll rasped, the void pulsating as it began to twist and morph, taking on the shapes of dark figures from Caius's nightmares. Fear clawed at him, but he stood firm, heart racing. He remembered the note pinned to the doll's chest. "Speak for me." In that moment of clarity, he realized what he had to do. "I reject you," he cried, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "You are nothing without me." The shadows roared in anger, and the doll's form flickered like a dying flame. The void recoiled as if struck, the dark figures swirling back into the doll's cracked body. With one last desperate push, Caius hurled the mallet into the void, and as it connected, a blinding flash of light erupted, engulfing the room. When the light faded, he found himself standing alone, the doll reduced to splinters, the shadows vanquished. But as he looked around, the silence felt too heavy, too still. Something was wrong. A shiver ran down his spine, and he instinctively turned toward the mirror hanging on the wall. Staring back at him was not just his reflection, it was the doll's twisted grin, contorted and triumphant, fixed on his face. "I told you, Caius, I'll always find you." With a gasp, he realized the truth. In his struggle to rid himself of the doll, he had unwittingly bound its essence to himself. He had become the puppet, and now the true performance was just beginning. Thanks for diving into the shadows with us. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. Stay curious, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the truth is scarier than fiction. Until next time, sleep tight if you can.